FantasySociety.com presents a Premier League Draft Fantasy Podcast. Welcome to the Key Pass Collective. Your exclusive source for the information, analysis, and advice you need to dominate your fantasy leagues. Come on in. We've been expecting you.
What's going on, draft heads? Welcome back to the Key Pass Collective. My name's Joe Williams. I'll be your host here for this episode, although this episode really is more of a re-release, just like we did previously with our episode with Overthinking Football, where we talked about expected fantasy points and went over a lot of different stats for the draft Premier League fantasy football game in order to help managers better understand how to draft, how to make their rankings, and generally in season how to comprehend and sort of think about the stats in the game. Well, we're back with another one of those. This is part 2 of our interview with Overthinking Football. And this took place back in 2021. You know, we talk about a lot of the various COVID restrictions and things like that going on. There were mentions of Jack Grealish at Aston Villa. So some interesting things as well. But this one is focused on war, not obviously global conflicts, but instead we're talking about wins above replacement. And for those of you who aren't American baseball fans, which I know can be a niche audience these days, if you're not in America, but wins above replacement is actually a stat that was originated in American baseball. So it's really interesting to see the guys at Overthinking Football utilizing this for especially the fantasy football, the Premier League fantasy football game. So if you want to better understand how to conceptualize this wins above replacement stat, this war stat, and the weekly war stat that Overthinking Football is going to be putting out, this is the episode for you. It is an incredible tool, an incredible statistic that can allow you to better understand the value of players. It can help with drafting, it can help with creating ranks, it can help with trading, as Chris actually discusses in the episode. It helps with trading of players, just generally how to value players above other players and how well those players perform when stacked up against any sort of like random waiver wire pickup. How much better is this particular player than another player? So this is better for measuring those kind of incremental differences between players, especially the ones that maybe in season you're considering dropping over a waiver wire guy, or again for a trade, maximizing the war that you're going to be receiving in that trade and giving away, I guess, less than you'll be hopefully getting back. It'll all make sense. Give it a listen. Without further ado, let me turn it over to the guys at Overthinking Football. We've got, as I mentioned, a special episode. We are actually chatting with the gentleman from Overthinking Football, which is pretty cool. I don't know if any of you caught the last episode, but Chris from Overthinking Football and I talked. It must have been, back on the 29th of August. And we talked about one of the metrics that they came up with in order to better assess the value of fantasy football players. And so we are going to chat with them again today to get the scoop on their newest metric that they've been working on, one that is going to be updated weekly, and one that will assist, I think, very greatly in drafts going forward this next year, but also throughout the season as well. So let's just take a second and we'll say hey to the gentleman, get to know them for a minute, and then we will talk over this metric and how it can help you as fantasy managers. It can be a little bit complicated, so we'll try to break it down as best we can for you. But to be honest, once you wrap your head around it, I really think it's going to be incredibly useful to managers and to listeners of the show. So welcome in, gentlemen, Chris and Will from Overthinking Football. So happy to have you guys back on.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having us on again, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's chat just really quickly. Let's kind of recap, if you will. Previously on, we talked about the other metric that you basically created, which is XFPTS. So basically expected fantasy points. This essentially was a metric that was created to measure or predict more or less what we can expect from a certain player in terms of their fantasy output, using a whole plethora of criteria that you all calculated behind the scenes. But then, we obviously had a good discussion about that. Listeners can go back and listen to that episode, but give us your elevator pitch for X fantasy points, for expected fantasy points, and how managers can use that.
Yeah, so I think it all sort of goes back to the fact that goals are incredibly rare. Goals and assists are very, very rare events, and they're worth a whole lot of points. And the idea behind expected fantasy points is to leverage currently existing statistics that we have not come up with, that have already existed, expected goals and expected assists. And basically what we do is, instead of using the points that players get from goals and assists, we instead scale the points they get based on the expected goal output or the expected assist output. So, very simply, if you have a player that scores 0.5 XG and scores 1 goal, instead of giving them the points for 1 goal, expected fantasy points gives them the points for 0.5 goals. So we basically use this to get a better sense for what players would be expected to score if they were scoring at the values, at the pace that expected goals and expected assists would suggest that they should score. So really the only difference between expected fantasy points and actual fantasy points are that we scale back the biggest point getters, so goals, assists, and clean sheets, using the expected goal and expected assist numbers for those players.
It almost sounds to me like you're saying, like, it takes a little bit of like that freak luck factor out of it. You know how sometimes teams can have an XG of like 0.8 and score 3 goals?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's exactly the way to think about it. So, if you have 1,000 games worth of sample size, then goals are going to be pretty much in line with expected goals. But we're operating on 38 games for an entire season.
Yeah.
And so especially early on in the season, when you have 5, 10, 15, 20 games only, converting the goal and assist numbers to expected numbers gives you a number that's probably more reflective of what this player's true value actually is, and what we could sort of actually expect this player to do in a given game.
I like it. And for way more in-depth discussion, you can go back again, 29th of August. It was episode 49 for anybody who wants to go back and listen to that. Those statistics are, of course, on your website in terms of the expected fantasy points. But today we're here to talk about war. And I'm not talking about U.S. imperialism. Hey,
it's your other podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also a soccer one. So it's like somehow it's like soccer and imperialism. Yeah. The football pitch as a war zone? I don't know. Okay, let's talk about war. So this is, it stands for wins above replacement. And you had previously published an article that did already kind of mention the use of this statistic and where it came from. And you sort of, if you want to say, converted it to the fantasy football game. But you did, I guess you had noticed kind of a couple of inconsistencies in it or tweaks that you wanted to make. So as far as talking about war, expected fantasy points really help us to kind of look at a player's sort of predicted output, whereas war kind of focuses more on their overall value to your fantasy team, as opposed to other players' who might be offering a similar or a different value, and how that then translates to wins. So tell us more about this WAR statistic, what it is, and how you guys seemingly kind of painstakingly calculate it.
Yeah, sure. So it's like you said, like you mentioned, we have a previous post on this that introduces the idea, and WAR is based on something that the baseball fans will be familiar with. And to boil it down to what we're doing, because there are some differences on what's actually happening in the baseball version versus what we're doing.
Sure.
We are trying to estimate how much more likely a team is to win given it has Bruno, for example, rather than just a generic waiver wire guy. So that's the replacement. Right?
Okay.
And really, we do this through a bunch of simulations, and you can think of the simulations as we're essentially simulating as if we had access to all the Fantrax leagues that are out there, and if they all had the same generic point system.
Sure.
So based on that, we do all these simulations and we look at how our player performed, so Bruno, for example, compared to how we would expect a generic waiver wire guy to perform. So the way that we actually do that simulation is given a given game week, we estimate who the starters are, who the waiver wire guys are based on their ownership.
Yeah. And
then we randomly select the starters and waiver wire guys, fill out teams, and simulate the game weeks.
And you simulated something like 5,000 times?
Yep, just a quick 5,000 simulations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that, like, I mean, there's maybe like 20 starters at each position each game week. And so, 20 starters at each position, there's a lot of different combinations of starters that exist. There's a lot of different Fantrax lineups that people have somewhere in the extended Fantrax universe.
Of course.
And so because of that, you need to run a lot of simulations to feel like you have seen basically a representation of all the different teams that are actually out there.
Oh, I love it. I just can't imagine the work. I mean, I love it. Yeah, I love the attention to detail. I think it's fantastic. And obviously, the more simulations you have, the more confident you are in the accuracy of the numbers, right?
Right. And thankfully, the computer does almost all the work.
Oh, nice. Okay.
We used to have an intern, but he it's a lot to do by hand.
Sitting there with an abacus, like, okay, now I'm gonna plug in Giovanni Lo Celso. I has to move 3 of the beads to the other side. Okay, cool. So, all right, wins above replacement. So basically, okay, if I'm getting this, it's a number that represents the number of wins your team would have if you had a certain player as opposed to a generic replacement player.
Right, a generic waiver wire guy.
Okay. But not another starter. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So it has to be wins above a guy that you could just find off the waiver wire.
Right. Because we thought that would be the most valuable thing to compare it to. Mm-hmm. If you have a guy that's coming in exactly 0 WAR, well, you should look at replace. You should at least gamble and see if you can grab a guy off the waiver wire.
No, 100%. And I think that makes a lot of sense because we're gonna use Bruno a few times, I think, in this discussion. But what managers I think really can use these numbers to help them with is something that, like you just mentioned, where okay, I've got a guy who like an Yves Basuma, or I've got like even somebody like a Stuart Armstrong. Should I play them over X person from the waiver wire? And those numbers are going to be a lot closer than, say, Bruno to the waiver wire, whoever it might be.
Right.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was on board. Okay, cool. You haven't lost me yet, so this is good. This is good. So the next thing I want to talk about then is the actual the number that managers are going to see, that people who log onto the website are going to see, and then how they actually conceptualize that and work that through in their brains. So, I mean, Chris knows very well, and when it comes to math, I'm basically not it. And so, if I'm trying to do anything more than basic addition, you're asking a lot of me. So, what I want everyone to be able to I guess wrap their heads around is, when you see numbers that can sometimes be daunting, whether they're decimals or whether it's some sort of fraction, how does your layman manager sort of use that number and know what it means? So let's say I have a player who has like a 0.2 WAR, because I know already just from looking at the article that you don't have like a 1 or 2 or 3 WAR. Like it's usually like a 0.1 or a 0.15 or 0.2. So if a player has like a 0.2 WAR for a game week, what does that actually mean?
So the way to think about that is the probability of winning that week if you had player X, player Bruno, right, compared to if you had a generic waiver wire guy playing that position. So for the 0.2 or the 0.2 probability, right, that you're talking about, the 0.2 WAR, the best way to think about that would be with that player in your team, you're 20% more probable to win a game compared to if you had the generic waiver wire guy in your team for that week. And just to conceptualize, the 0.2 is actually quite good, right? So if you had 0.13 for a whole season, just every season your person is putting up 0.13, that's a KDB level of 1920 performance.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess because I didn't realize 0.2, a 20% probably, that's insane. Yeah, that's a lot. So it's actually going to be even more minute than that. We're looking at, like you said, 0.13, we're looking at 0.8, 0.08, 0.02, 0.03.
Yeah, I think another way to sort of put it, hopefully will help build a little intuition for it. So like, let's go back to the 0.2. So basically we run these simulations where we have teams that have Bruno in it and then a bunch of random other starters. So for 0.2, you're basically saying that the team with Bruno wins about 60% of its games, whereas the teams that have the same exact team as the one with Bruno, except Bruno is replaced by a waiver wire guy, they win, say, 40% of the time. So, the probability of Bruno's team winning is 0.6, and the probability of just some random waiver wire guy winning is 0.4. So that difference is then 0.2. And I think that makes it kind of clear that like 0.2 is a lot.
Yeah.
Like if you have that 20% extra probability, that's a whole lot.
That is. Yeah, that really is. And then extrapolate that over the course of the season, which is kind of what your new initiative, that you guys are taking on board. That kind of is what it is, where if you think about that combined throughout the course of the season, like that equals a lot. I mean, that's a significant number of wins that you're getting from that player just alone.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, so you basically have unveiled on the site, and listeners should definitely go and read the article. Overthinkingfootball.com, and the article is called War 2.0 Weekly War. And basically what you're doing here is essentially you're going to be tracking this week to week and releasing updated war numbers after each game week. So those numbers will begin to compound. So as users start to log in and see these numbers, what kind of insights, as we start to get a feel for, the average, or we start to get a feel for a certain player's war based upon not just one but multiple game weeks, what kind of insights can we get from those numbers?
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to, I think the very brief summary is that something like expected fantasy points is really good for like a short-term decision. So if you have two guys you're trying to weigh, like, do I want to start this guy or do I want to start this guy? Whichever player has higher expected fantasy points is the guy that you want in your lineup. WAR, on the other hand, this is more of a long-term value assessment. So if you're looking to do a trade or you're looking to set up your draft board for the upcoming season, you really want players that you think will provide you more wins over the course of a season. And so, as we update the WAR scores for a single game, just like normal fantasy points, a single game week is not really that informative. A player could get really lucky. A player could get really unlucky. So each individual weekly WAR update is not going to be all that informative, other than making kind of cool GIFs. But we update it and, schedule permitting after every game week. But every additional data point gives you more confidence in what a player is or is not producing. So, when you look at this point in the season, we can feel pretty good about the WAR scores. And as long as there weren't any major injuries that would maybe skew what they have, you can kind of look at their total WAR and make a projection and say, well, this player has amassed, 2 WAR in the last 10 game weeks, which would be an absurd amount. Like, that's the type of player that you really would want to get into your lineup long term. It could be that for an individual start-sit decision, you'd prefer somebody else based on other metrics like expected fantasy points. But when assessing trades and draft boards, the WAR value really gives you a more nuanced look at what kind of value, aka wins, a certain player is producing for your team.
Yeah. Okay. And so it sounds like those week to week WAR numbers, then they stack, and then they eventually, are they just added together? How does that work? Or it doesn't sound like they're average, because you said they can have a 2 or like a 1.5.
Yeah, they're added together. So you can think of it, this is how many wins this player has contributed to in a given week, and then you take the next week, right? So if the next week, let's say the first week the player does well, gives you positive WAR, 0.13, right? And then a following week they don't do well, they do worse than you can do worse than a waiver wire person, right?
Yeah.
In that scenario, you would lose some more. So you'll see that you'll gain and lose WAR throughout the season. Obviously, you want to gain. A player you are interested in should be gaining WAR rather than losing. But there are interesting different player profiles, right? So some players are steadily gaining WAR,
yeah,
but not very much. Other players are boom bust.
Yeah, where they might come back down to earth, but then skyrocket the next week and then have a down week again. And yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. So this makes me kind of wonder, and I think you guys saw that I was putting down some notes in the document as I was sort of like just thinking through this. This makes me wonder, and mathematically, I'm sure this isn't appropriate for me to actually do, but it makes me wonder, like, can't I just add the WAR of my players and know how many wins above replacement I'm going to be dealing with on my whole team? That's not a possible thing, right?
So it's hard. This is a tough question that we've been trying to wrap our heads around, because it's like the natural thing to do. So I don't blame you whatsoever. You can imagine that you have two teams that are really, really good and every other team is bad. So the bad teams, I guess what I'm trying to say is that your team's sum total of WAR is dependent on what other teams' sum totals of WAR look like. So what we have here is sort of based on a hypothetical 8, 10, 12-man leagues that they're relatively even. So there's no teams that are extremely good or extremely bad. They all have their lineups essentially pulled from this average starter pool for a given week. So you can't quite do that. We're still working on honestly just wrapping our heads around what that number truly means if you sum every player on your team's WAR score. I mean, clearly teams that have very high total WARs of all their players are going to be the best teams. But it's not like a direct translation into this is how many wins my team has earned this season.
Right.
So...
No, that makes sense, and clearly just a shortcut that somebody like me would look for in the mathematics around the whole thing.
I mean, but that is a number you want to maximize. Like you want to do anything you can to maximize the total sum of WAR for all your players.
Right. I mean, so I guess this kind of, and you were mentioning how they have to be considered among the WAR of all the different players for that same starting week. And this kind of led me to think about what you mentioned in the article where you said, one of the most fascinating parts for me was when you said that it's not always a player like a KDB or like a Sterling when he scores 3 goals or something, something like that. It's not always a player like that who gets the highest WAR because of what his teammates do in that same match. Does one of you want to take a stab at kind of explaining that?
Sure, I'll take a stab, and Chris, jump in if you.
Yeah, I'm referring to like the Rafinha example, like that you gave, just in case I don't want to lead you down a rabbit hole.
Well, I was thinking for the Sterling case, right? You have an example where other players are contributing to his goals there, right? So they're going to get bumped up. So, but their WAR will be improved as well, or I guess their fantasy points will be improved as well, and that has to go into the week of players you could be playing against for when you calculate the WAR, right?
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so if KDB fed Sterling in for all 3 of his goals, then KDB is going to be catching up with Sterling in the WAR, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But the same goes for players on other teams. If somebody else has a stellar week, that even though, so in the example we gave, Rafinha scored a bunch of points, but nobody else did. But in a week that Jack Grealish plays against Liverpool, he's feeding it. He scores a bunch of points, but so do all the other Aston Villa players.
Yeah.
And a couple other guys, if I remember correctly, from other teams had big weeks too. So those points become less valuable in that week.
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's making sense for sure. It was something I had to sit and think about for a minute. But Chris, did you want to say anything before I kind of explain how I was thinking about it?
Yeah, I think it's just really important to remember that points don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So if Sterling was just sort of a throwaway example. It wasn't. He's not necessarily a player that fits that kind of profile. But when you score a hat trick, but you get an assist every single time from the same player, that means that there's a chance that you are playing the player that fed your player all the goals. Mm-hmm. So what you really want in a perfect scenario, you have a player who scores like only solo goals. Nobody is assisting him. And so he's not sharing the points at all. And guys like KDB are actually incredibly valuable. Like a statistic like key passes is, it's perhaps overvalued in terms of point totals, but it provides so many good WAR increasing points because it's not as linked to a second player getting points as, for example, an assist is. So an assist is, except for own goals, is always going to lead to some other player getting a goal. Whereas a key pass, sometimes it leads to an assist. So sometimes it leads to a goal. Sometimes it leads to a shot on target, but it doesn't always. It doesn't have to. Aerials are the same way. When you score an aerial, only your player is the one scoring the points.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a strategy to target those types of points specifically, but I think it's important to remember that every player is linked and players don't score points in vacuums. You have a decent chance of playing against the guy who provided the assist, which we all I'm sure are terribly familiar with.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So that's interesting because, I mean that I guess that what that says to me is that when teams have a really just a stellar week, like Leicester today, scoring 5 goals. Kelechi Iheanacho had a hat trick, and of course his WAR is going to be incredibly high. Jamie Vardy had a hat trick of assists. So when it comes to like the wins above replacement, this is exactly what you're saying, Chris. I'm just trying to kind of reiterate. When it comes to the wins above replacements, well, the replacement, unfortunately, in this case, we have to also factor in the other players who played, right? And so Jamie Vardy, if you had Kelechi, or Kelechi, if you had Jamie Vardy, it has to be factored into the other players that that are also getting WAR scores. So your score is not going to be all that much higher than his in the general scheme of like the pool of players.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think another way to make the point is like in a blank game week, if you have a player that scores 30 points, that's way more valuable than one of your players scoring 30 points in a double game week, because everybody's scoring more points in double game weeks. So if you really want to have a player that decides a match, that provides significant WAR contributions, you really want to score a lot of points, a lot more points relative to the other players that week.
I like it. Okay. WAR is recognizing a little bit more kind of like outliers and giving them credit for their performance as an individual.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it.
Interesting. Okay, cool. I like that. So what does that tell us? Like, let's go back to Bruno quickly. I mean, because looking at the site, you guys talk about him a few times. His WAR is like even that much higher than the rest of his teammates, and like he assists a lot. He's sure he scores some goals and he has the penalties, yes, but at the same time, like his teammates are still scoring. So you would think that his WAR wouldn't be maybe that much higher than the rest of his teammates, but it appears it is.
We'd have to really get into the numbers to see exactly why this is happening. But I would guess it's just primarily it's because he is everything going forward is going through Bruno, right? For the most part.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure.
So he is involved in anything good happening on offense for United right now. And because of that, he's got tons of key passes. He's assisting most of the goals. He's scoring a bunch of goals if he's not assisting. And turns out he's pretty good. If you should pick him up if he's on the waivers.
I love it. Yes, absolutely. His ownership should be at 100%.
Yeah,
I haven't checked lately, but
that's the hard hitting analysis you visit our site for.
This is what the statistics tell us.
It's perfect.
Advanced analytics.
Yep, he is a player who definitely should be rostered in every league. Let's just kind of talk about the plan for publishing this weekly, and if you had to kind of put yourself in the shoes of just a layman, fantasy manager who's gonna pop into your site for 15 minutes a week, get a feel for the updated WAR numbers. What am I looking for? How can I be the best consumer of this information?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, it's very valuable for draft prep, and it's very valuable for trades in season. So the numbers need to be taken in context. So you need to know, like, was a player hurt? Did a player miss significant time? But after you do checks like that, you can look at the total WAR of the player that you have, or the player that you're trading for. I mean, ultimately your trades, obviously there are things to take into account, lineup considerations such as like, oh, I really, really need a mid. Then you might make WAR concessions. But ultimately, you don't really want to trade a player that has more WAR for a player that has less WAR.
Oh.
I mean, you want to maximize the number of wins that your players provide. And so, if you're trading for 2 players,
just add the WAR together, like I was saying.
Exactly.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No. I mean, that's in this case, that is right. I mean,
Yes. Okay. All right.
if you're comparing two players versus one player, for instance, one of your players is going to have to leave your lineup, or you're going to have to drop a player. But if the player that you're trading and the player that you're dropping, if their WAR is less than the players that you're getting, that's another piece of evidence that might be a good trade for you. Or on the flip side, that it might be a bad trade for you.
I hadn't even thought about this as a way to sort of put a value on trades. I love that angle. That's great.
Yeah, so I think it can be very useful for trades. And then for draft prep,
I was just about to ask you that.
Yeah, while you can look at the total WAR, and the total WAR is still a very useful number, I think that the average WAR might be more useful. So we have that as one of the columns in our table on our website. And we go through an example for Phil Foden in our first WAR article we published last year. But essentially the idea is you can project how many wins you think a player might amass in a coming season. So, for example, if Phil Foden scores 0.1 average WAR per week this year when he starts, you might say, okay, well, he only started, I don't know how many games he started, but let's say he's only started 25 games this year, which I think is more than he started.
Probably, yeah.
You can then, honestly, Foden's a terrible example because of Pep Roulette, but if you can project how many starts you think a player will get, you can multiply that player's average WAR by the number of starts that you expect, and then that is a projection of the WAR that you think that they'll get in the following season. While it's painstaking to do this for every player, there are some players who score incredibly well in, say, 15 starts, but you think that they might be in for a huge season. You can do this kind of thing to rank them relative to their performance this year to get an idea of what you think they might produce in the following season.
Now, sorry, Chris, if they don't play though, what happens to that specific game week? Is that how's that calculated? Is that negative? Is that a zero? Is that?
Yeah. So if they don't play, that's basically they are the replacement player.
Oh, okay.
So obviously this doesn't take into account all the nuances of roster construction. So maybe if you don't start this player, you can't drop him, but you also can't replace him. In that case, he's definitely going to be negative WAR. But for the algorithm's purposes, we assume that when a player does not start, there is this average waiver wire guy that Will was describing that you can pick up. And because it's based on ownership numbers, it's a pretty fair assumption that the players we consider waiver wire players are players you can actually pick up. I guess long story short, when a player does not start in a given game week, he is given 0 WAR.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was just going to say, for people who want to use this, you can use that to look into how much WAR people are getting when they start versus their numbers will drop off, right? You'll just, or not drop off, you'll actually stay flat, right? So if you look at the GIFs, when you see a player go flat, most of the time, as long as there's not, if there's imperceivable or very small changes, that means they're playing and they're just being an average player. But if they go flat, that's a way of seeing they're hurt and they're out. And you can use, if this is a tip for how to use WAR potentially for actually valuing your players.
I like it. Yeah, and by the way, the GIFs are really cool. Those are sweet. I know you guys are really proud of those, but you should be because they're awesome. Listeners, if you haven't seen them, basically they start from the beginning of the season and then they kind of spider out based upon how various players do, and then most of the GIFs will track one player and their ups and downs, and then you can see kind of where their WAR ends up at the end of whichever game week we're at that point. It's really cool. It's really neat. So the only thing I think we maybe didn't mention is the average PWAS, average PWAS, is the only stat that people I think are going to see on the site that maybe we haven't talked over, because we talked about total WAR, which is the added WAR values for the game weeks. You just mentioned average WAR. Active game weeks I think speaks for itself, but then average PWAS. Do you want to let people know what that is so they're not freaked out?
Honestly, we should remove this from the table.
Okay.
I mean,
For our own uses.
yeah. I mean, it's the average probability of winning above starters. So it's a number it ranges from 0 to 1. It's a probability, and all it means is that for a given game week, this is the probability that we've calculated, the average probability that a team with that player wins against a team of against an average team of starters. So basically, if you look at the chart, Bruno Fernandes, his average PWAS is 0.59. So that's basically just saying that, if you assume that the average starter team is scoring 0.5, like their probability of winning is random, 0.5, then his average PWAS is just a measure of what is the probability that he wins above a team that's just starters. It's kind of convoluted, honestly.
I don't know. I think it's valuable. I kind of like that because you have the WAR deals with the replacements, whereas the PWAS deals with the starters. So if you ever have a question as to like, all right, this guy, I know how he's performing in terms of the average replacements, but in terms of like the other starters that are in that starter pool, right? Those are the ones that you're using to basically run the simulations, right?
Yeah, it's the average PWAS minus the waiver wire PWAS. So
okay.
How a waiver wire team performs against a team of all starters. So like for Bruno, his average WAR is 0.15 and his average PWAS is like 0.6. So that then implies that his average waiver wire PWAS is like, 0.6 minus 0.15, 0.45. So yeah, it's a number that is necessary for calculating WAR, and we have all the PWAS numbers and all the waiver wire PWAS numbers in the spreadsheet that you can download at the bottom. But honestly, it's a little there's some value to it for sure, and it's necessary for calculation, but I don't know how directly useful it is to a user.
Sure, no, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that because I am one of the people who will probably get scared off by things like that. So I just want to make sure we cover everything just so people know exactly what they're seeing, and they could rewind if they wanted to, listen to a certain part over just to know how to digest a certain number that they're seeing in terms of that actual table that they're looking at once they log into the site and look at your WAR ranking. So just wanted to make sure that everybody was, everything was explained to a certain amount.
No, it makes sense.
Maybe to the amount that I would need to be comfortable with. So I think that does it for WAR, guys. Unless you had anything else you wanted to add, I do have one final kind of thing that I want to get your input on. But let's stick with WAR for a second. If there's anything else you want to pitch or let us know about.
Yeah, go ahead, Will. If you got
one
something.
thing for another exclusive you can only get here, that just a hint on how to use WAR, is the distributions are different for different positions. So it's worth looking at how an easy to see example is you'll see that for the midfielders, Jack and Bruno are breaking away, and they're clearly far more valuable than even your best starters. And so taking into account by position, how much a player is contributing to wins is really worth doing, because, for example, defenders don't normally score as many points as someone who's a midfielder or forward, but they are in fact giving you wins over the replacement defender. And it means you can soak up the points at that position that your opponents can't.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we're planning on releasing a short article at some point diving into that. Just to sort of repeat it, it's kind of just like the Rafinha Jack Grealish example. So Rafinha is more valuable because he is a greater outlier than Grealish is amongst the other players in Grealish's game week.
Right.
And so in the exact same way, what Will is pointing out is that, Cancelo maybe doesn't have as many. So he's our best defender. He maybe doesn't have as many wins as, say, Heung-min Son, Harry Kane, Mason Mount. But he does have a lot more wins than the next best defender.
Right.
And so he is basically a defender outlier. And those are the kinds of players you really want. You want the outliers within their position group, rather than necessarily whoever has the most points in a given week or the most points for a position.
And
so
that has draft implications.
Right.
Like massive, because that makes the case for taking a defender early. I mean, particular defenders, certain defenders, because of their value to the position. And you're not looking for them to score necessarily as many points as another player, but it's the positional value is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
You have to put somebody there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you don't want it to be a replacement. This is what we've learned right here.
Well, it depends. Depends on who you have.
Oh, great. Here we go. Wait, I'm lost again.
We're giving you the classic statistics answer of, well, it depends.
Yes, but no. Perfect. All right, guys. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll go ahead and wrap her up. And if anybody has any questions at all, they can get at you. And I realized, Chris, after we last time after we recorded, I didn't say your Twitter handle correctly. I said that it was Overthinking Football, but it's not.
Everybody gets it wrong. There are too many characters.
Right.
I can't get it right sometimes.
So if you search Overthinking Football, you're going to find them, but it's at OVRTHNK Football, all one word. OVRTHNK Football, all one word. That pesky character limit.
Yep.
Well, again, thank you guys. I appreciate you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time. And if people have any questions, I'll encourage them to get at you, because I know you guys love a good DM and to share the work that you've been working on. So
for sure. Thanks so much, Joe. It's awesome. Love being on the pod.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Will. Pleasure to have you, man. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. Anytime.
Awesome. Talk to you guys again soon.
All right. Bye.